So this week we're going to start our chapter one. I do want us to get to remember what is Eric Foner's main point throughout the book and Give Me Liberty is that question of what is freedom. Even after we make our Constitution, we are still wrestling with different factions within the United States on helping or progressing on this concept of what freedom is. Some of us feel that we're getting closer to the concepts. Others may feel that we're still working at it. Behind the U.S. Constitution is the influence of Great Britain and its constitutional monarchy. So the U.S. Constitution doesn't come out of nowhere. It is born from Great Britain and their quest to make a rational society that is built on reason and built on freedom also. Even though we have had a revolution from them, I do like to make a point that much of our culture is influenced by the British. And the British have their own influences from the ancient world, and we're going to kind of tackle them a little bit because they still resonate within our society today. And these influences include going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, particularly the Athenians, as a concept of a free citizen. For both Athens and Rome, the free citizen wasn't born with these natural rights. People didn't have concepts of human rights either. These were rights that were guaranteed to you because your nation or your country or ethnicity are the ones that are dominating the area or the land. For instance, an Athenian is free; they usually own slaves. A Roman is free; they have control of the markets. And so we wouldn't typically equate the same type of free citizen, but we would like to say that the Athenians were the first to try to have these free citizens participate in government in a democracy. So this is our influence from the Athenians. Okay, this idea that the individual has rights above the entire group that should be protected as being a citizen. The influence that Great Britain gets from Rome is the idea of securing markets. We'll see how Great Britain does that. Right before the American Revolution, they have control of the oceans. They see that as their top priority, and then they establish their empire. Again, this is very similar to the Roman playbook. Coming from their religious history is a Judeo-Christian concept of free will. This is not the same as the free citizen. The free will means that every individual is born with free will and every individual's freedom should be respected. And this is the influence that we get with John Locke and Thomas Jefferson with the idea that all people are created equal and that these are human rights. Okay, but we can already see that there's some conflict between these two concepts, and this conflict still is part of our society today. The other type of influence that comes through Great Britain and to us is the idea of rugged individualism coming from the German tribes. And we'll see this develop as this is an old concept that it's even more extreme than you might say this free citizen. This individualism is always concerned about central government. And even though these are two different types of cultures here, there is some similarity between a sort of healthy, and sometimes it's a healthy critique of central government. At times it can be a little out of control and over individualized. But as you can see, Great Britain's influences do not necessarily meld together, and our Western societies that are influenced by Great Britain have a lot of weight and baggage coming through with them. This weight includes trying to maintain the individual over the group or society, having these rights. Others include establishing colonies, establishing an empire. So how would you secure markets and defend people's rights of the people you're conquering at the same time? How do you develop a government if you have highly individualized individuals who don't trust each other? And how do we get to that concept of Athens' idea of democracy? So even before we start this chapter in chapter one, we already see some conflicts within our history and our stem of history. So we do have to do a little bit of world history. We're not going to go too much. I do want to kind of help map things out for your mind of what are the influences coming through history and affecting both the British and us, our history, and our experience today. Okay, we live in our era. We call it the postmodern era. Some people still believe we live in a modern era, but that is up to date. And as you hear me say the word era, eras are defined throughout history as uh, times in which people had a collective idea of what truth was. So if we go to the point of the Middle Ages, we see it here, truth was a Christian truth. Okay, things like good and bad were very absolute and easy to understand. The seven deadly sins are bad. What happens to you at the end? You go to hell. And what is a good thing to do is to follow what the church is asking, and most importantly, what the nobility is asking, and that's what makes a good person. So this worldview of the Middle Ages was very clear and nice and defined for them. Okay, their world is changed when science and reason come into play from a little bit from the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. We'll get into that a little bit, and we get what we call the Age of Enlightenment. We're told that we could finally find some kind of predictability. And with science, there's this hope that maybe we can carry on this predictability of the science into a government, a type of government run by reason. Okay, and this is where we have this promise that we can make a better society moving forward into our modern period. When we move into our modern period, we take the same ideas of the Enlightenment, but now we incorporate hyper political structures such as uh, the Constitution, like I mentioned earlier before, formulaic economic structures like capitalism. But late in the modern era, we have these other types of formulations like fascism and communism, which actually become very deadly and have very bad consequences. So Europe experiences a modern crisis, and they begin to doubt some of the previous ideas of truth that they had in this period here. We move over here to postmodernism, and our own example in our own history would be the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War is America's questioning of what truth is. And as when you get to 1302, you would see a little bit more of this influence. I'm sure your instructors will break this down a little bit more. If you look at our world history, I have down here these hierarchies or these structures of hierarchies. I'll break them down a little bit as we go through. But I would make a point that each hierarchy is defined by the era that they're in. Okay, and I'd like for us to break down our first hierarchy that we find in history, and that is the hierarchies of the ancient civilization. Okay, without organization, if we were to look at the way people have lived for mostly 200,000 years of modern human history, people are mostly hunter-gatherers. And within the hunter-gatherer society, they're glued together by family relationships. There are no laws. There may be customs and rituals and stories, but there is very little hierarchical structure. There may be some chiefs and some medicine people that may play a higher role, but these are small societies. They don't get very big, and they're not very complicated in terms of doing various tasks. After the Neolithic Revolution, you do have these larger communities that are not formed by families within the entire city, but are families within the city. So you can say that they're strangers among each other, sharing tasks and work to keep society going, to keep the food going, and so forth. So depending on what you do is where you're going to live and experience your life within these cities. For instance, if you're a high priest, most likely you have the bigger homes with these hanging gardens, and you have the better food. If you're the ancient king, most likely also you're going to be there. There's a very important relationship between the ancient priest and the ancient king in maintaining the myth or the story of why you belong where you belong. So the high priest would make sure that the rituals and the books would be, or I would say the scribes will repeat these stories to get people to stay within the structure that they belong. So why would a warrior possibly live closer to the better parts of the town, more space, more luxury? They're the ones who expand the wealth of the society, especially the wealth of the king and the upper class, and they're the ones that protect. And then further out, you would get your merchants and traders. Okay, that's very important. And at the end, you have the farmers, and they're probably most likely the ones living in the outskirts of the town and working and doing the major work. I'd like to also make a point in terms, there is ancient slaves also. The farmers and the ancient slaves are going to make up the majority of the people. The further you go up, the more power you have, the less there is in terms of people. So the king would represent a very and royalty would represent a very, very small percentage of population, but have most of the ability to make laws and control society and so forth. And then you have your wars and so forth along this. So this is what that triangle necessarily means. It means that the further you go up, the less the population of power, but the more power the individual has. And the myth is maintained here with these polytheistic stories of why certain people belong in certain places. So what would you find here in the ancient Sumeria is as a story, for instance, of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it explains how an active king is the one that grows society, and a king should look at history as a way of being immortal on the things they do. So as we leave ancient civilizations, we go to the Bronze Age or the late Iron Age, and I want to take a better look at Athens' structure and not necessarily Spartans. The Spartans use an oligarchy. It's the Athenians that try something different, and many of the people within Athens have to be both the farmer and the warrior. So you don't have necessarily the division of class. So the citizens are the ones that both defend the city and are also participating in the city's economy. You do, however, have the structure between the wealthy farmers that are smaller and the more poor farmers that are a little bit bigger. But the problem that Athens has is that both are used for protection and for expansion of the Athenian cities and their allies. So how do they solve the problem of having governorship or running the country without having that centralized authority? Well, they develop a concept called democracy, and they understand that there's going to be factions or differences between the rich and the poor and so forth. And in a democracy, it comes down to, if everyone's vote counts, it comes down to the art of persuasion, what we call politics. And so with this idea, you can manipulate society, or you can have society turn to a direction you want to do in terms of an economic plan, a war, a need to defend or to help allies. Whatever decisions are made are done by democratic vote. But like Socrates found out very early, it really comes down to the ability to persuade and use political language to get people to vote the direction you have. So democracy, according to Socrates, has a little bit of a flaw, or I would say a bigger flaw, the way he pronounces it, in that the rich are able to use their linguistic authority, their higher education, to change the dynamic of the way democracy works. So we're going to transition from the Greeks, and I'd like to remind you, what do we learn from the Greeks? What's the most important concept we get from them is democracy, and this idea that the citizens should participate in direction of the government. But you do have a problem, like I mentioned earlier, with the wealthy having a little bit more influence. We're going to start the next video with ancient Rome. I'll talk about centralized society and the importance of the fall of Rome on British and American history. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.